Hey, what follows is my notes from the Creation Astronomy video. Earth's magnetic field is unique in the solar system, deflecting the sun's radiation from our atmosphere and too strong for evolutionary models. Venus, however, lacks a magnetic field at all, again defying Big Bang evolutionary models. Mercury, on the other hand, is far too dense for evolutionary models. Jupiter spins at too fast a rate, one rotation every 10 Earth days, in such a large size of the planet, and is composed of too much gas to be supported by evolutionary theories. Likewise Uranus and Neptune. But Uranus has the added complexity of spinning on its side at 90 degrees to the solar equator. Any attempts to explain different peculiarities of the planets by proposing that giant asteroids crushed, tilted or formed moons cannot be given evidence, as there is no debris or crater formations correlating to such theories. The moon of Earth itself is precisely positioned to cover the sun's outline from view as seen from the Earth's surface. If it was slightly farther away from Earth, the tides would not be sufficient for coral reef formation and the majority of marine life. But if it was too close, the tides would be far too dangerous for shipping. What's more, the craters of the moon show 3 periods of asteroid collisions, massive impacts causing lava to smooth over previous impact craters, but to then be subsequently impacted by fresh craters of recent minor impacts, showing a time span of lava affectation that evidently occurred in too short a time for evolutionary models. The position of the moon is measured by lunar lander instruments and is seen to be getting an inch and a half further away from Earth each year. Therefore, at that rate of movement, the moon would have been too close to Earth a relatively short time ago, and yet does not contain the correct minerals to have been ejected from the Earth's surface. It also has volcanic activity that defies evolutionary theories of the moon not being a young formation. The Big Bang theory also presumes that planets formed from colliding materials which became asteroids and in turn collided to form planetoids. But any materials observed colliding in space when smaller than an asteroid only proved to smash into finer particles, rocks and dust having the inability to stick together at all from mere collisions. Evolutionists will draw up catastrophe theories to explain the water situation on Mars, but will not accept any catastrophe hypothesis on Earth. Such might explain geological formations and fossils resulting from a great flood like that described by the book of Genesis. In fact, if the ocean's floors and mountaintops were all levelled out, the amount of water on Earth would spread out over the entire globe to a depth of more than a mile. If the world was as small as an apple, the entire Earth's crust would fit into the apple's skin. So it is very obvious that any catastrophe involving asteroid collision will cause a plastic-like fluctuation in the Earth's surface. Just because tectonic plates are observed moving at a steady slow rate at the present date, that doesn't mean they have always moved at that rate. It is even suggested that the Gulf of Mexico is the crater of an asteroid impact, iridium found in Yucatan, supporting this hypothesis. An impact that massive could even have split the Americas from a previously singular landmass, affectionately known as Gondwana land. The conclusion to the displacement of such a large amount of water is no great issue when we realize that the oceans hold so much water between tectonic plates currently that would not necessarily have always held such depths before such an astronomical catastrophe. What we learned from Spike Saris, the former US military space program engineer, is that the Big Bang faults, such as being sourced from quantum gravity with no theory to explain how the Big Bang could have come from that. The physics law of conservation of mass energy has to be violated to construct the Big Bang. The Big Bang should have resulted in large-scale temperature differences in the cosmic microwave background, but we find that they are relatively uniform throughout the universe. The Big Bang should have produced a curved universe, but instead we find that it is flat. The Big Bang should have produced monopoles throughout the elements, but it hasn't. The theory of inflation doesn't solve these problems and basically says we got everything from nothing. The inflaton that drives inflation has never been seen or demonstrated. It is theorized that missing mass that makes the gravity required for some fast-spinning galaxies to remain intact is made of invisible dark matter, but if found, this would require another model of the Big Bang. Anti-gravity, that accelerated expansion of galaxies away from each other, is thought to be from dark energy, and so the Big Bang would only explain 5% of the universe, which is the visible matter. An insufficient theory then. If the Big Bang had created just one more grain of sand, then the universe would have collapsed into a black hole. One less grain of sand and the universe would have expanded too quickly. For dark matter to have formed, the Big Bang would have to have been more finely tuned even than that. Well, the story of NASA's space flights is really quite dramatic. What I had seen as exploding rockets on TV were actually unmanned and were only test rockets in the development stages of the Gemini program. Their Gemini missions were only the first steps into outer space. The Russians were in fact ahead of the Americans during this phase of the space race, involving getting a chimp into orbit, testing if man could even survive in the weightless space, extending the time spent in orbit, enlarging cabin capacity for 2 astronauts, and a rendezvous of 2 vehicles in orbit. When the rocket size was expanded in Saturn V models to lift off 3 astronauts, sadly the high oxygen conditions were not accounted for, and the first crew incinerated in a cabin fire before any rockets were even ignited. Subsequent missions were successful all the same, and progressive missions tested lunar and lander flight, orbit of the moon, lunar lander moon orbit maneuvers, and finally a moon landing. Even so, one mission to land on the moon was aborted due to an explosion of a gas canister, and the crew barely made it back to Earth alive. It was only the on-the-spot improvising of ground crew that enabled instructing of the crew to craft a device that absorbed carbon dioxide that saved them from air poisoning. I think that was Apollo 13. Eventually more flights to the moon were made, and even a moon buggy was deployed in order to explore a larger area of the lunar surface. The last mission was apparently not the one James Michener described in his historic novel titled Space, in which he describes the rover being deployed on the dark side of the moon, only to be hit by a solar flare's radiation and render the crew too weakened to return to the orbiting command module. Other videos propose that aliens in fact stopped the further moon missions, and that UFOs have been caught on live footage that NASA won't disclose, or that other man-made structures were already on the moon as well. What they did use another Saturn V rocket for was the emplacement of the Skylab space station, as the extra fuel space for a trip to the moon was not needed merely for a flight into Earth orbit. So that section of the rocket could be fitted out with the Skylab module, and subsequent missions brought astronauts to install the interior equipment. Skylab was a great success and proved that men could live in space for long periods very well, if not better than if they did not go to space. It did require some risky spacewalks to make exterior adjustments, but in the end James Irwin practiced in a water tank on Earth, well enough to get the spacewalk gear prepared adequately to complete the space station. Skylab eventually fell from orbit in the 80s and crashed into the Western Australian desert, ironically quite close to the Carnarvon moon landing radar dish that helped James Irwin land on the moon to begin with. In any case, the Space Shuttle program continued progress in space technology, enabling astronauts to land without needing the Navy to retrieve them from deep sea splashdowns. Jetpacks were tested and made the longest spacewalks possible. A robotic crane enabled satellites to be placed in orbit without need of retro rockets to be part of the satellite structure, and such satellites could be revisited by shuttle crews to repair or upgrade them. The largest number of extravehicular spacewalkers were deployed to repair the Hubble telescope and install an improved system to focus the lens. However, one shuttle named Challenger was launched on a morning after a night that was too cold for the equipment to function well, and an O-ring was found to have failed as a result. It was determined from the breeze that the crew would have been alive all the way until the cockpit hit the water below, but it had soared another 30,000 feet before that happened, and the crew, despite having activated support systems, would have passed out unconscious by then. The space shuttle was used to dock with a Russian module and eventually connected a Western module to it. But before the crew of the new space station, hence in construction, could be retrieved, the shuttle named Columbia also blew up on re-entry. Ground cameras had detected a heat shield tile come loose on liftoff and strike the shuttle's wing. This evidently punctured a hole that then caused the breakup of the whole spacecraft in the high temperature and pressure of entering Earth's atmosphere at 14,000 kmh. Such risks are taken into consideration by astronauts before committing to their missions though, and eventually the International Space Station was completed with a rail track and many more modules and solar panels. The Space Shuttle program seems to have been closed down now that it was 2012, the date of Doomsday. That passed, okay. But ex-NASA staff has also announced publicly that UFO sightings were covered up by authorities, and there may not be enough public support for the further use of space shuttles. Other designs have been proposed, and even remote control rovers have been sent to Mars, and now private companies are beginning to send their own spacecraft into orbit independent of NASA. To further discuss UFOs, a documentary called The Disclosure Project shows top military personnel admitting that the government has covered up UFO sightings. In particular, the UFOs were sighted at nuclear missile sites, both in the US and in Britain, disabling missiles. Also, the space shuttle caught such an incident on video as a test missile came into orbit, but a UFO came and fired a ray at it to disable it. The video was confiscated by authorities and is not available to the public. So it appears there are these angelic aliens trying to prevent us from having a nuclear war or something. The Disclosure Project also showed that aircraft radars pick up so much unidentified phenomenon that they have to be programmed to filter it all out. One witness to a UFO sighting was, nonetheless, the former US President Jimmy Carter. Aliens are reported of in the Bible too. In Revelation chapter 4, verse 6 to 8, 4 living creatures at the throne of God are described that are nothing but alien creatures glorifying God. Ephesians 6:12 tells us that there are evil forces in the heavenly realms of outer space as well. Angels are like winds or flames of fire that can materialize and appear as humans. For some people, entertain them without realizing who they really are. In Job chapter 1, however, angels report to God's throne, also described as sons of God. Job 38:7 says that the angels were present at the laying of the earth's cornerstone at the beginning of time. So they are a type of alien that regularly visit the earth and work to encourage those of us who will receive salvation from God through Jesus Christ. Of course, the grey aliens with the big bulbous eyes are not described by the Bible other than to be a part of the heavenly hosts, of which descriptions are not specified in Psalm 8:5. Whatever the case, God is described by Ezekiel as flying in what appears to be a UFO. Gyroscopic apparatus are accompanied by yet more alien creatures covered by a glassy or icy expanse on top of which is God's throne. When Ezekiel saw this, he was so overcome that he fell face down. Many think that the descriptions given by the prophets of the Bible are actually of technological items that they can only use ancient pre-industrial picture language to describe them with, such as chariots of fire, wheels spinning within wheels, and even the helicopter-like locusts with the wings thundering as horses' hooves. In any case, God's power far outdoes anything physical, so he would not rely on technology to fly or something, and he can protect us from any evil forces, such as mental telepathy, that attack our souls.